in his view also, we have a number of different commonalities between the various classical realists. So I'm not going to present all of them because, of course, that would take a very, very long time. So I'm just picking out, if you like, Thucydides as one example. But in general, we can say the commonalities between the various scholars of classical realism are that human nature inevitably leads to insecurity and conflict. They all share this idea that human nature ultimately results in insecurity and conflict. So they have developed a body of knowledge, or a body of wisdom, as they would call it, to deal with that problem of security. In a sense, it's inevitable. It always will arise. So this is how, in a sense, we can deal with it based on their ideas in terms of classical realism. Ultimately, they say there is no escape from the human political condition. There is no permanent solution to the problems of international politics. You might call that a very pessimistic view, and a lot of scholars have called it a pessimistic view. But that's their view of humankind, that in the end, humankind is not totally corrigible. Human nature is ultimately prone to conflict and security. Now, this is something that, of course, a number of scholars reacted. In particular, as I told you, at the end of the Cold War, there were a number of really major transformations. If you know Francis Fukuyama, he wrote about the end of history at the time. And of course, there was generally a much, much more optimistic mood at the end of the Cold War, that major transformations are possible in the international system, that realists have been overemphasizing, in particular, the aspect of state survival. Realists are really very insistent that the main objective for security, for political leaders, is the state survival. Now, at the end of the Cold War, that emphasis was starting to be seen as perhaps overly strong on survival, because as we've seen, in particular in the 20th century and in the 21st century, we actually see more and more states being developed rather than states disappearing. We have seen in history several states disappearing, but of course, the more recent trends have rather been those of states appearing. There's of course also the current American hegemony, and in general, the realist tradition is also perceived as what some scholars call Western-centric. So they have developed other ideas such as Third World School, subaltern realism. There's different aspects of how scholars have suggested to in a sense, overcome this Western-centric criticism. They therefore suggest that realists are overemphasizing this aspect of state security, and therefore we need to look more about international cooperation and international society. So this, in a sense, brought about a number of different trends, a number of different thinkings on security. In particular, Krauss and Williams in 1996, they argued that there's really two new trends out there. This is now in the 90s, so it's not quite so new anymore, but I think it's still not accepted by all scholars. It's still something of a debate around those issues. The first trend is the broadening of the security agenda, that in reality, there's many more security threats than just military security threats, and they need to also be included on the security agenda. Here, the suggestion is, for instance, of economic and environmental issues, migration, transnational crime, diseases and health, human rights, etc., etc. So they were already talking about health and diseases, for instance, in 1996, when we didn't know about COVID. So all of this relatively new, but the suggestion here is we really need a significant broadening of that security agenda. The second suggestion is we need a deepening of the security agenda. What that means is an inclusion of new referent objects of security. New referent objects being, for instance, individual human beings, society, the region, etc., etc. But especially the idea that an individual should be the new referent object of security is something that has been quite new at the time, that it was all about states previously. So why should we have this new thinking on security? Well, there's a conviction that neo-realists focus on the security of the state from external military threats, but that this isn't really adequate anymore. Yeah? So the suggestion here is that we need to move away from only focusing on military threats. That doesn't mean that we don't focus on military threats. It just means that we look at military threats as part of a whole range of threats that we need to look at. What did realists, and especially neo-realists, do when they were confronted with this? They basically didn't like this. They didn't like this at all as a suggestion, because they suggested that this takes security studies away from its traditional focus and methods, and it would make the discipline intellectually incoherent and practically irrelevant. This is what Mersheimer and Wale suggested. Intellectually incoherent, practically irrelevant, they said. Now, continuing on here, though, is the debate about, well, what's the contentious issues here, really? The main contentious issues between the different, if you like, parties in the debate between the realists and those who are pushing for a more nuanced and perhaps broader and deeper security agenda is that of the scientific status of security studies. And the neo-realists suggest that, in their view, security studies should be an objective and a scientific discipline. What they mean with that is very much following Karl Popper, very much uncovering the laws governing the realm of security. Laws meaning the kind of patterns, the cumulative knowledge, the parsimonious theories that are really valid across time and space. That those are not, in a sense, dependent on every context, they're not dependent on every situation, but they are in fact laws in their view that govern security. And their idea is to really uncover these laws and then make them into an objective and scientific disciplines. They follow the standard canon of scientific research, basically develop hypotheses and then empirically test those hypotheses. They then say that this allows you to make predictions, that allows predictions, and therefore by making predictions has a practical relevance for security analysts. From this, make a prediction, comes true, it doesn't come true, but you have a practical relevance in reality. That's what they say. Based on this, they have a series of foundational claims, i.e. assumptions that we see them as assumptions, but they're presented perhaps as facts. So this is something that is object of debate. Here, very much so, security studies has been at the heart of neo-realist criticisms. Neo-realist criticisms of new approaches to security that are often seen as perhaps as too idealistic. They kind of dismiss new security approaches as you know, those are, in a sense, that's wishful thinking. You know, you may think that this is what we should take into account, but in the reality of the world, this is not important. In the reality of the world that is what we realists are focusing on, so this is what we need to analyze. But increasingly then scholars were wondering, now that the neo-realists have, in a sense, really clearly spelled out their criticism of other scholars, do they actually conform to these scientific standards themselves? Are they actually following those scientific standards that they claim the others are not following? And there has been a lot of criticism on that point, that yes, they're raising the bar very high for others to follow, but they're not actually following those standards themselves. So in a sense, people and scholars that are arguing for new security approaches, for instance, as I mentioned, Krauss and Williams in 1996, they suggest that there are several problems really in realist thinking. Firstly, well, when we analyze data, we interpret data, and interpretation